I think I'm going to be talking more about the political context. If you read the New York Times and the Financial Times every morning, as I do, there are clearly two types of news. On the one hand, the financial crisis. On the other, the crisis of these post-conflict countries. And since Chris mentioned the book of a colleague of ours at the Center on Capitalism and Society, Leo Tillman, I want to mention that my book just came out from Oxford University Press on rebuilding war-torn states. And what I find is that these two crises are focused by different people. I mean, economists, Wall Street people are talking about the financial crisis as if the conflict and post-conflict crisis didn't exist. And my husband asks me every morning why it takes me so long to read the paper, is that I have to, as an expert on crisis, I have to read about the financial crisis, and then all these countries, Afghanistan, Iraq, now the Democratic Republic of Congo, and so forth. So why is it that the two are so interlinked? And I don't want to go through this in great detail, but I think there are many reasons. And one of the things that I found in the research I did for this book is that the situation with regards to the countries that move from war to peace is dismal. About half of the countries that move in this direction, they go back to war. This is statistics from the UN. But more worrisome, from my analysis, what I found is that a large part of the 50% that remain in peace, like Mozambique and Uganda and all these countries, they become highly debt aid dependent, and therefore the model is not sustainable. Now, what I wanted to discuss and show you the crisis, but Joel did such a great job that I'm not going to spend any time on that. What I want to say is that somehow I look at the financial crisis and I focus more on the emerging countries. So I think one of the clear trends is that emerging countries are going to play a much larger role in the dynamism, in the future dynamism of the economy. But what I want to talk a little bit today is the reasons why the US economy in particular, but the European economies as well, why they were so vulnerable to the crisis. The crisis, in my view, would not have been so deep had it not been for the weakness of the US economy at the time. And one of the things is that, you know, when we think of conflict, we think about the human tragedy, which is really bad, but we hardly ever think about the economic consequences of that. And the economic consequences have been very large, not only for the US, for instance, in the case of Iraq, but also for the international community because of all the problems with displaced populations, with refugees, and so forth. But the other impact, you know, we have 1 billion of the 6 billion people you were talking about, 1 billion people live in countries in conflict or post-conflict. And therefore, you have problems with drugs and terrorism. Now we see what's happening between Pakistan and India, two nuclear powers. And we know the impact of conflict and post-conflict on environmental degradation, and the financial and economic implications of these is extremely large. I just was in Mexico last week. We had our annual conference there, and I saw the impact of the drug cartels are having on foreign investment and other economic aspects in the Mexican economy. And the same with terrorism. I mean, the reason why the terrorism took place in Mumbai was clearly a focus to disrupting the economic miracle in India. So these things are very much interrelated. And the price of oil was a major factor in the subprime crisis. I think the price of oil at the time of the Iraq war was $35. It went to $140. And this created a number of pressures for energy alternatives and the production of ethanol and the tariffs that the U.S. imposed and all that. So the price of energy, which increased the transport cost of many of the food products, that created also a food price crisis. So the two things, the price of food and the price of energy and transport, were major factors in the subprime crisis because many people had to, they couldn't pay their mortgages. Now, the issue is how the price reversal is going to affect emerging markets. Now, the issue of the financial cost of this crisis, and I'm going to focus on the US because that's the data I know, but it has had tremendous implications. These countries are very small. They have had, I'm sure Professor Young would agree with me, of the political impact they have had. The crisis in Kosovo started the problems between the US and Russia, which was aggravated by the crisis in Georgia. The crisis in Iraq created tremendous pressure in relations between the US and Europe. So these countries have a disproportionate political weight in the world economy. Now, on the financial cost, very few people, when I've been talking about this data among financial experts, they question the data, and the data is from the US government. And what has happened since the beginning of the war in Afghanistan and in Iraq, the additional extraordinary appropriations, which are in addition to the Department of Defense budget, which represents 6% of US GDP. In addition, these appropriations have reached $860 billion. So this amounts to $3,000 per US person. The same with the new package to Georgia. The international community just committed $4.5 billion, which is $1,000 per person in Georgia for the next 2 years. So the demand for resources coming from countries in conflict and post-conflict is tremendous. And obviously, there is a trade-off. There is a trade-off between the demand for these countries, and there is a trade-off, the demands for normal development and the demands for the environment and so forth. Now, the weight of the wars in the US is tremendous. I mean, the debt has increased over $10 trillion, and people like another member of the center, of our center, Joe Stiglitz, they have estimated that if you take not only the budgetary but the non-budgetary cost, the war on Iraq has cost $3 trillion. So now, there are also other costs, and people don't realize now in the foreign policy agenda of President-elect Obama, there is some idea that they are going to be increased multilateralism. But multilateralism also costs a lot, not only to the US, but the international community. And we know that the budget of the UN is $2.5 trillion. The peacekeeping is $3.5 billion, and the budget for the programs and agencies of the UN, it's about $16-18 billion. So all this demand is in addition to the need that the US will have and the European countries will have to increase infrastructure in their own countries to increase demand in their own countries and reactivate their economies. So what do I see about the trends? How are these countries affected by these wars? And I think it's important to distinguish between what are mature or donor countries and what are emerging markets. I think in the mature markets, I think there is a clear, well, the political consequences have been large, but also it has created a lot of constraints. I'm sure that the US would be much more likely to take certain measures had it not been for a fiscal situation which is horrible. I mean, since 2003, the budget deficit has averaged close to $500 billion a year in the US. So that limits the ability of the US government to deal with the financial crisis. In emerging countries, it's, and then the two wars, the causality between the two wars and the financial implications are also reversed, because the financial crisis is not going to allow the US and the European Union to invest and to help countries coming out of war the way they could had it not been for the financial crisis. Now, what happens in emerging markets? In emerging markets, I've been traveling a lot in Latin America during the last year, and there was denial. There was the issue, I heard over and over in different countries, the issue of decoupling. And I think there has been some decoupling in the commercial sense, in the trade sense. But in the financial aspects, I think there was clearly no decoupling at all. I mean, the impact of the markets, the international fall in the price of the stock markets was immediately translated into a fall in the Bovespa and other. So really decoupling. Then the danger of protectionism and anti-globalization forces, that's going to affect emerging markets very much. I think the issue of outsourcing also, there is a lot of criticisms in the US about companies that have outsourced to India and other countries. The other aspect is that emerging markets are also important troop contributors, and that's how the two crises are linked to them. And they have become new donors. We have China, for instance, investing and doing large infrastructure projects in these countries coming out of war in Africa and elsewhere. The other thing is that in the decoupling in the trade area means that there will be new trade associations and investment patterns in emerging countries. Now, how are the two crises affected in post-conflict countries? And I think obviously the issue of aid and the involvement of the international community is going to be revised in light of the financial crisis. I think taxpayers like myself, who pay 50% of my salary in taxes, will demand more accountability on how these funds are used in these countries coming out of war with such bad results. I mean, if half go back to war and the other half become aid dependent, I could think of only two countries that became self-sufficient, and that's Croatia and El Salvador. All the others have levels of aid that are not sustainable. That's one of the things that characterizes countries that are in the transition from war to peace, that there are big spikes of aid, and countries like Rwanda, for instance, aid accounted for 90, close to 100% of GDP, and many other countries have levels of aid in that period from 40, 50% of GDP. But after a while, aid should fall to normal levels, which is 2, 3, 5% of GDP, but not more than that. If a country, to be viable, needs levels of aid of 30, 40%, it's not a sustainable level for the international community. Well, let me talk about the trends, and here I want to quote Yogi Berra, who said that predictions are very difficult, particularly about the past, so about the future. Sorry. So, is this the end of capitalism? Is it a move to corporatism, as Joel said? And definitely, it looks like that in the short run. The issue is whether the French type of model that the international community has fallen into by default, whether that's going to reactivate the dynamism that it's necessary to create the jobs that the international community will need to move out of this crisis. Is there going to be more regulation? And here I think I have a little bit of a difference with Joel. I don't think that the problem was lack of regulation. In fact, the hedge funds were not regulated at all, and they were not involved in the financial crisis. On the other hand, I think there was very bad regulation. I think I blame the rating agencies for a large part. This crisis would have never occurred, as previous crises would not have occurred, like Enron, for instance, and some of the sovereign crises, had it not been for the flawed model of the rating agencies. I think the rating agencies are very regulated because the regulation gives them a monopoly power, in the sense that mutual funds and pension funds need 6 Bs, which gives Standard & Poor's and Moody's a duopoly power in this type of rating of this type of assets. So they were very regulated. In fact, they have been giving increasing power to the rating agencies. Basel II gives them even more power in the banking sector. So I think the problem was not lack of regulation, it was bad regulation. So what I would like to see going forward is better regulation, but not more regulation. Now, I think people are going to talk about the financial sector as before and after Lehman, and I think there were some lessons learned. The fact that Lehman, because of the moral hazard and all that, was left to fail. I think the fact that Geithner, as future Treasury Secretary, I think he has learned a lesson how dangerous that was. So I think the danger of misguided policies, in part because of what Joel said, the experience with regulation and protectionism following the Great Depression. I think people are very much aware of that danger. So I don't see that as a big problem going forward. I think the model of corporate governance is going to change completely. I think bonuses are going to be related to performance, which they weren't in the past. I think crises always create opportunities for improvement, and I think the financial sector, hopefully, will consolidate and be stronger in the future. I was surprised by the data that Joel showed. I think it's clearly the end of cheap and easy credit, but I was surprised to see that some type of credit is still growing. I think in the short run, there is a clear flight to safety, and there are deflationary forces. I think some of the data he mentioned with regards to consumer purchases, sales after in this new period that started after Thanksgiving, has to do with the fact that in the US, prices have collapsed. There are these sales, 50% sales, 80% sales, that in other normal times, they don't come until January, so that distorts the data. It's not the case in Madrid. I've been shopping, and I was amazed to see stores with three floors, and I was the only one there. And I wasn't even shopping. I was making this kind of survey to see what the stage was of the crisis was here. So I think in the short run, the flight to safety, which we have seen, I mean, we have seen investors in Brazil leave Bovespa and come and invest in treasury bills in the US, and you wonder why. But it's the flight to safety. I think this is going to keep the dollar up and the purchasing power of the dollar up in the short run. I think in the long run, however, there is a serious danger of inflation. So what are the challenges for emerging markets? First of all, reactivating the economy, and I think the only way to do it is through better innovation and inclusion. I think the previous model resulted in the exclusion of large parts of the population, and I think it's going to be less and less acceptable in the future. So the issue of how to reactivate dynamism with inclusion is going to be very important, and the issue is whether the French model will do it, or it will have to be adapted in the future. Now, it will depend on how successful they are in removing the toxic default-ridden assets, dealing with the oversupply of housing inventory. I heard in Madrid there are 2 million apartments empty. This is a problem in the US, it's a problem all over Europe. And you know, how to deal with consumption in light of the falling wealth, increasing unemployment, and so forth. And how it will depend how successful governments are in restoring confidence. Now, in emerging markets, I think I discussed the issue of decoupling. I think clearly there won't be decoupling. I think markets are very much integrated. The issue of contagion is very different from previous crises. Now, for instance, the big issue in Mexico, for instance, is through remittances. Remittances were larger than foreign direct investment in Mexico, and they are highly related to what's happening in the construction market. So until the construction market reactivates in the US, that's going to be very much restricted. So they haven't been able to play the counter-cyclical role that they played in previous crises. Now the world will be more dependent on emerging markets. That will the amount of it will depend on how successful China and India and other countries are in reactivating internal rather than external growth. There will be, I think there will be an increase in multilateralism, which is not strange given particularly President Bush policies of the last years. And I think there will be an increasing role of emerging markets as creditors. I was in a conference not too long ago where this Sheikha, who is the Minister of Trade in Abu Dhabi, she was talking about the large sovereign funds they have and how they are looking for new markets. So I see a new role there. The issue is how countries are going to attract this type of financing. Now, for countries in conflict, post-conflict, the status quo is not sustainable. I think aid is clearly in this array. I think issues of humanitarian, which increases consumption versus reconstruction aid to increase investment and jobs, has to be debated. I think the fragmented way in which aid is provided rather than in an integrated way, the overcost heads and other issues using inputs and contractors from the donor countries has to be rethought. I think taxpayers are going to be much more discriminated, and governments will have to rethink and have a global, comprehensive rather than a piecemeal strategy. Finally, I want to looking forward, I think the issue of dynamism and inclusive growth, which is what Professor Phelps calls the good economy. I think if you asked me what are the 3 challenges in any of the countries I discussed, the mature donor countries, the emerging markets, and the countries coming out of war. I think the challenge is everywhere the same: jobs, jobs, and jobs. The issue is whether you can get this type of inclusive growth with welfare programs or humanitarian assistance that in a way create work and other distortions, or whether you have to think outside the box. And a way that Phelps has been thinking outside the box for many years has been the fact that he has been recommending that to include into the labor force the workers that have no skills and have been excluded from the market as a result of globalization and other trends, that rather than having training programs set up by the government, as they do in Latin America and in Europe, to give subsidies directly to the enterprises, so that the enterprises, by lowering the cost of hiring people, they would hire people without the skills, with a commitment to train them and keep them. And if they don't want to keep them, those people will go to the labor market already with some skills. The issue is whether this is applicable to many countries or not. And to the countries in conflict and post-conflict, this could be a way in which aid could be effectively used to create jobs and reactivate the economy. It's encouraging that Obama, during the campaign, talked about hiring subsidies. So this is something that it's under discussion in the US. And hopefully other countries will consider it. Thank you very much.